Quote, Renaissance Europe had its own flourishing tradition of dietary advice. Then, as now, an industry of experts churn out diet books for an eager and concerned public, end quote. So my question is this, really? Dieting was a thing in history? Dr. Albala, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I want to start our conversation with your book that is titled Eating Right in the Renaissance, because I read the following in a review of the book. Quote, Renaissance Europe had its own flourishing tradition of dietary advice. Then, as now, an industry of experts churn out diet books for an eager and concerned public, end quote. So my question is this, really? Dieting was a thing in history?
Well, dieting did not mean originally weight loss diet. That's only one kind of diet. This was the things you should eat to stay healthy according to your particular constitution, which they categorized in 4 different classes, meaning you were born sanguine, which means you had a lot of blood in your body. And that meant you were ruddy and strong and generally cheerful, or you were phlegmatic, which means you're lazy and soft and you have watery humors, cold and moist humors, or you were choleric, which meant that you are prone to anger and outbursts and your blood is, you're hot and dry, or you were a melancholic, which means that you are sad and you have cold and dry humors predominate. So these 4 types.
Those sound more psychological than constitutional.
Absolutely are, but they're also physiological body types, which determine what kind of food you should eat, what kind of correctives you should do to bring your body back into humoral balance. And the idea was that if you are, let's say, hot-blooded, if you're choleric, you should eat things that are cold and moist, that are going to bring you into what the Greeks called eukrasia, or good humor, meaning that you'd be balanced. And in fact, we still use sort of humoral logic when we describe something, let's say a martini, as dry. It's not dry, it's liquid, obviously, but the effect it has on your body, it's a pertains, so it kind of dries out your taste buds, makes them smack like tannins, right? And when we say something is hot, meaning spicy, it's not hot temperature-wise, it's hot because it has that effect on your body. It heats you up. So there's still weirdly a humoral logic in much of the stuff that we just common parlance, really. But to address the other part of your question, was this a flourishing industry? So I looked, this was actually my doctoral dissertation. So I actually wrote most of that before 1993. And in terms of how much was actually published, I looked at the stuff between 1450 and 1650, and there are about 120 books that are just on this, what to eat, how to stay healthy, based on this humoral logic. So that's a lot. And I just followed from the beginning of printing until other systems start to appear. That's mid 17th century.
Okay, let's go back and address some of these things that you said. First, correctives. Define that term for me, please. What does that mean?
So this means balancing with the opposite. And if you're sort of talking about medicine, this is called allopathic medicine. It's the opposite of homeopathic, which means you cure with likes. Allopathic means that you cure with opposites. So if you have a cold, we still use the humoral term for that, you balance it with something that's hot. Hot and moist will cold and dry, or whatever it may be, you balance with something that's the opposite. And this could be food. It could be changing your atmosphere. So the weather has a lot to do with it. Bundling up obviously warms your body. Exercise does, as does your sleep patterns, as does the amount of sexual activity you have. So this is not, when they say diet, they don't mean the very narrow sense of what you eat. Dieta in Latin actually means all of these things that you have control over. You don't have control over some things with health, but your body temperature, the environment, the amount of sleep you get, the processes of digestion and evacuation are part of this. They're what the Arab philosophers called the non-naturals. And it doesn't mean that they're unnatural. It means that they're things which are inside your body that you can actually control. They're not outside you in nature.
Some of the words that you're using are concepts, hot, cold, um, and all the other things like dry. Uh, they're not that historic. I recall both of my grandmothers saying things like, "Oh, don't eat that. That's cold. It's not good for your constitution." I'm trying to
Exactly.
translate it into English. Or don't eat this. That's too hot. Or other words that it's not medical advice, but it sort of goes back to some of the things you were sharing. Um, what was the purpose of these correctives? From what you said earlier, I take it none of them for being slimmer, right?
Well, no, weight loss diets don't really come about until about the 18th century. And in fact, if you look at, they certainly understood that some people are bigger than others, but they considered that to be just a phlegmatic constitution. It meant that if you eat a lot of food and you're well nourished, the excess nutrients would just get deposited as fat on your body because it's cold and it
I see.
congeals there and it sticks. People who have hotter running constitutions, choleric or sanguine people, and especially if you get more exercise, the fat doesn't congeal there. So it really is very, it's not only very logical, but strangely the origins of this physiology, which are Hippocrates and Galen, really have to do with cooking metaphors. Most of what they think is going on in your body is actually cooking. And in fact, in Latin, the word, when you eat food and it goes into your stomach, it cooks with the digestive heat. Koksha,
Interesting.
what it would be
You
called.
are what you eat, so to speak, right?
Well, yeah, totally.
So let's
Um,
talk about what it meant to eat right, quote unquote, centuries past.
sure, sure.
Yeah, give me some
So,
examples, please.
so some of the stuff has to do with eating according to your humoral complexion. Hot people should eat cold foods. Dry people should eat moistening foods like cucumbers if you're dry, like spicy foods if you're melancholic or phlegmatic. If you're really choleric, you want to eat something that's sour. So in general, the way that they categorized foods was that if it was sweet, it was hot and moist, meaning nutritious, good for you. Sugar is the best thing you could eat. It's the most nutritious, healthy food you could possibly get your hands on. And things that are spicy or like pepper, or things that are biting or salty, those are hot and dry. Things that are bitter are cold and dry, and things that are phlegmatic are cold and moist and watery. So peaches, cucumbers, sour things also fit in that category. So the logic is really just balancing the food against your complexion, but also balancing the food with each other. So there's a strange logic of, say, if something is difficult to digest, let's say it's a phlegmatic food like fish, you'd want something that's cutting and abstersive that's going to make it easier to digest. So you put lemon juice on your fish so it doesn't clog up
Interesting.
your system. But aside from this whole humoral thing, the ancient Greeks, and this is really where this stuff comes from, were also obsessed with the digestibility of the food, meaning how much digestive heat and effort does it take to break it down. And foods that are really coarse and rough, like beef or beans or cabbage, those things have to be eaten only by people who have very strong digestive systems, so like peasants and laborers. Whereas foods that are light and white and delicate and sweet can be eaten by people who don't get a lot of exercise, especially scholars and people who are in business and don't get a whole lot of manual labor. So there's a kind of social stigma based, in within this whole diet from the very, very start. Is pheasant is for noblemen and wealthy people, and cabbage and beans and turnips are for peasants. And that's the way it has to be, because if you give something very light to a peasant, like a delicate chicken or capon, it's going to burn up in their system and they won't get any nutritional value.
This is
And if
so
you
crazy.
it's amazing. And if you give something really indigestible like tough beef to a scholar, forget it. It's going to corrupt in their stomach, never get digested. Foul vapors will go into their heads. They will have nightmares, and they'll ultimately get sick.
This
Um,
makes me think of our trip to London 3 weeks ago. We were in the Tower of London, and they told us the reason these big veterans that were in the tower called beef eaters
Yeah.
The reason they're called that is because they were fed beef. That's what they ate. And you see him,
Well,
he's like above 6 feet tall.
that is a British thing, obviously.
Yeah.
But
But it's,
another part of this whole system, interestingly, is this idea that the food that is most similar to you is the one that can be most easily assimilated into your body. So the stuff that is most nutritious is meat. In fact, human meat, human flesh would be the most nutritious if you were allowed to eat it. But pig comes close, beef, things that are close to us, things that are not similar to us, like vegetables, are really not nutritious, which is why it's good to eat them during Lent, because you are not going to get any nutritional value. You're not going to have this excess of nutrients, which they believed, and this is going to sound bizarre also, that if the excess of nutrients didn't congeal as fat in your body, it turned into sperm in men and women. I don't know, this is bizarre. So, and that signals your libido. So you have to be very careful during Lent and on fasting days that you cannot eat meat. This is the whole logic of it,
oh
because then you're
boy.
going to get aroused and you're going to be inclined to sin. So the whole
I'll remember that next time I have a burger.
yeah, well, absolutely. So it's not only meat; it's also wine. Wine is the analog to bloods, for obvious, in Christianity also, and so it's the thing that's most easily converted into your own blood. So wine is a necessary nutrient, believe it or not.
Oh, I see. I love that. I'll have to this Friday night. I'll remember that. You mentioned cucumbers. In I was reviewing one of your writings, and you were saying melons and cucumbers were a no-no. Did I read that correctly? People love them, but I guess
Yeah. So
experts were saying don't have them. Is that it?
well, they are particularly dangerous, and the idea is that they are phlegmatic. They go bad very easily outside your body, but also inside your body. So that if you have let's say you've just eaten a meal, and then at the end you have some peaches, they're going to sit on top of that meal undigested through the assimilation of nutrients, through the creation of humors, through the spirits that are generated in your lungs when air comes in, through the things that flow through your brain. So it really will totally ruin your whole system.
Oh
Now, I
wow.
think that because of this, people said, "Oh, my doctor's telling me don't eat peaches. I'm going to eat peaches. I'm
Oh,
going
I
to do it
love
anyway."
it.
And especially the
Well,
fashion at the time was to cut the peaches up in little squares and drop them in your sweet white wine, tesserae. They're like little mosaic pieces, little
oh,
cubes, and
interesting.
you put it and it chilled wine with ice and some peaches in it. And I had this last night actually.
Oh
It's
wow,
great.
that
It's
sounds great.
fabulous. It is great.
You mentioned libido. They had advice about sex. We're not talking about diet, but the type of food that you should have for a better sex life.
Well, yeah, I've written a lot about aphrodisiacs, and I think in general, people come up with completely mistaken ideas about why certain things are aphrodisiac because they have phallic shape or they have a texture that's somehow like genitals or whatever. That's not the logic at all. The real reason that most things are aphrodisiac is precisely because they're very nutritious. It's things like beef, like wine, things that are going to heat your system up. They're going to have an excess of nutrition that's going to stimulate your libido. And you have to also notice that when
Not
they're talking
oysters?
about this, they're oysters, not really,
Not really.
no, not at that time. That's a very
Yeah.
18th to 19th century era of Casanova to the present kind of
Yeah.
thing. But for things that were nutritious and wine were the best aphrodisiacs in their mind. But there's a whole category of other things that accidentally become aphrodisiacs because they're salty and they create an itch in the genitals, which is kind of bizarre. That's a quote I think from Clement of Alexandria,
Oh
and that's why
wow.
oysters. That's how oysters originally come in there. It's the saltiness and the brininess. There's also some, and I know this is going to sound absolutely absurd, but there's some foods that inflate your body that are like,
You mean
they cause
bloat
gas,
you?
obviously, things that are difficult to digest, turnips,
Yeah.
whatever, root vegetables, because they're not refined by the sun. They're underground. So they have crude humors, as they would have said. So when you eat those things, your whole body inflates. Now, you remember those little stress toys that you squeezed and the
Yeah.
nose
Yeah.
would come out or so, the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
eyeballs would
Yeah.
pop out? That's
Yeah.
what they're thinking, is that you get erect from
Oh my.
foods that inflate you. artificially.
Wow, next time I'm bloated, it's going to have a whole different meaning. It's just going to feel weird. Thanks to you, Dr. Abdallah. We'll be back after a short break to talk about foodstuffs that were new to Europe. We'll be right back.